Welcome to the Arts Club of Washington. I'm Doritt Carroll, I'm Vice President here, and I'm delighted to see you all. If you're not familiar with the Arts Club of Washington, we offer programs in basically any art form you can think of, as well as the visual art that you see in our galleries, and you can find out more about it at artsclubofwashington.org. Lots of free programs, lots of things for everyone. We hope you'll check us out. Tonight, without Karen, of course, many of you are here because you were probably invited by Karen, who wound up having COVID tonight, but the show must go on. And this is the book From the Belly, which she organized and edited, Poems Responding to Gertrude Stein. And luckily, Marty has agreed to take over her role. So I'm going to welcome her to the floor and let her take over.
Welcome, everybody. As you know, or may not know, Karen Larew is probably the Gertrude Stein of the Washington area and the world. You know, she has just been such a fan of Gertrude Stein for years and years, and has introduced so many people to Gertrude Stein. So she's provided me with a very nice script, which I will follow, and her introduction was that From the Belly was her it's her 3-volume project, which is based on the 3 sections of Tender Buttons. The first one is Objects, Food, and Rooms, and volume 1, which is the one we have now, is the Objects, and the cover is a beautiful cover done by Grace Cavalieri, who, along with being Poet Laureate of the world, is also an amazing artist. It's featured, the cover is featured. And Objects follows Stein's order of sub-poem presentation. This reading will showcase 5 Tender Buttons poems and responses from tonight's readers, including myself. I'm going to read Karen's poems and her responses, and also you'll see how the program is structured. I will read Stein's Tender Buttons poem for each responding poet, which will help distinguish Stein from the responding poets. And Stein set up so that it was almost like a call and response, a dialogue. Once you enter into it, it's really a beautiful thing. So I've asked each reader to do a soundbite of their own bio, so they'll tell you about themselves. They're going to give you a signature poem, or one that's their particular favorite right now, and that way you'll be able to hear their own voice, and then that will help you to distinguish how their response was, you know, in the Gertrude Stein response, how their own voice came to that response. And then we're going to conclude with individual readings, and then they're going to say something, each one will say something about their process. What did they do to think about how they would write this poem? Because if any of you know, or if you've not been introduced to Gertrude Stein, it's like cracking a nut. You know, it's not an easy thing, but it's a really worthy thing. So Karen Larew is the first poet published by WordWorks in 1975 and in 1923. She's the editor of From the Belly, Poets Respond to Gertrude Stein's Tender Buttons. And her signature poem is about Leo, the brother of Gertrude Stein, and she's always had the fascination with Gertrude Stein. Leo on Seesaw, for the pleasure of Gertrude Stein. Little Buddha, little brother, kleiner brooder, tiny brother, biddy bother, sitting badly in the butter, in the batter, shaking philosophic digits in the kitchen, for the kuchen has been eaten by the kitten, wearing mittens in the winter, hiding splinters in his fingers, finding spiders in the cracks of the plaster. So we laughed, 20, ha, 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 ha. in metered breathing, something close to the day he was born. So recently this is going to be very hard for me because my French is terrible, but recently she was asked to translate one of the poems for Grace Cavalieri's Voice as a Bridge, an annual program which takes place right here in July in the Arts Club and was not recorded. So she wanted to reprise that reading, and she had translated her signature poem, Leo and Seesaw, because Gertrude Stein lived most of her life in France, and she hoped it might help persuade you to how important the subject of Gertrude Stein is to her, to Karen. Leo sur la balsonnière, pour les plaisirs de Gertrude Stein. Petite Bouddha, enfant bordure, kleiner Bruder, toute grande blagueur, peu de peine, assis chauve, dans le beurre, dans le pâté, suçant ses pouces philosophiques dans la cuisine, parce que le couchen a été mangé par les chatons, portant des gants en bruitant, cachant des chards dans ses doigts, trouvant des frêlons dans les fissures du plâtre. Alors nous avons ri, 21, ha, 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 en respiration mesurée, quelque chose de proche de la journée, il est né. She's written so many Tender Buttons poems, and some of you may know, she also wrote an opera dedicated to Gertrude Stein. So the one she wrote to respond to today is called A Blue Coat. A blue coat is guided away, guided and guided away. That is the particular color that is used for that length, and not any width, not even more than a shadow. And her response is, a blue coat, whether gendarme, one arm extended, ended by white glove uniform, a length of sky and ice, cerulean coast, Côte d'Azur, sea and land, fractal lines and infinity, a dark closet for custom cloaks, Nup, petite blue, blown through tubes, pneumatic freaky, jockey pornography covers all, blue singing A, B, C. And her process, as she describes it, is, in France, as in the United States, the police were dressed in blue, or at least blue coats. The French initially had their gendarmes dressed in red pants with blue coats. Blue is an exceptionally evocative color during Stein's life in Paris. Her friend Pablo Picasso, who invited her to visit him on the Côte d'Azur, had his blue period, and there was the intra-city telegram, Le Petit Bleu, which was sent through pneumatic tubes in Paris. And now our first reader is Henry Crawford, responding to Tender Buttons.
Thank you very much. And yes, I am Henry Crawford, and I am the author of two collections of poetry, American Software, which was published by C.W. Books in 2017, and The Binary Planet, which was published by the WordWorks in 2020. My signature poem is The Fruits of Famine, and this is a poem that I have had the pleasure of reading on Capitol Hill, and I've also had the opportunity to read this at a 2,300-year-old Greek amphitheater. It is a poem that speaks to global hunger, and it is the fruits of famine. On those nights, we traced the shapes of fruit until the dark became our eyes. On those nights, we left our fields, unhearing the crack of broken roots, the silence of dying ground. On those nights, twilight filled the deserts of our crossing with the vermilion breath of watermelon. On those nights, the stars seeded the skies above the camp. Jackfruit guards stood still as celery stalks. On those nights, we dreamed, like you, of strawberry days on porcelain plates. On those nights, I made an apple out of sand and watched it blow away. I responded to a piano.
A piano. If the speed is open, if the color is careless, if the event is overtaken, if the selection of a strong scent is not awkward, if the button holder is held by all the weaving color, and there is no color, not any color, if there is no dirt in a pin, and there can be none scarcely, if there is not, the place is the same as upstanding. This is no dark custom, and it even is not acted in any such way that restraint is not spread. That is spread. It shuts and it lifts, and awkwardly, not awkwardly, the center is standing.
And my response to a piano was an open piano, a love poem. It was the day I noticed the mustard jar squatting heavy on the refrigerator shelf. The day I looked up the word awkwardly in our blue promiscuous dictionary. Yes, it was the day I noticed my socks running out of thread, so I called upstairs for a hand. That day, the one when the telephone was let off the hook and almonds broke out all over us. The very day I handed you my driver's license and took your glass of warm, refreshing milk in a careless, never-ceasing way. You know that day, the time I heard a sound like a salon coming out of our living room. The day I looked in to see a black enameled cover lifted off the piano and keys exploding all over your finite grin. That day, when nothing stood between us. Oh yes, my process. Okay, I'm trying to get out of Dodge here. Regarding this one really came from Stein. I looked at it, and you have to blame her for that poem. I just looked at that poem, and I saw the piano, and immediately I said, yes, that is a love. I'm going to take that piano, I'm going to open it, and I'm going to talk about love. Language will do that. I did it in 10 revisions, which is remarkably small. I'm one of these like revisioners, I'll go on and on and on. Just 10, and I was done. So there's not much more I can say about that except blame Stein. Thank you.
Thank you. First off, let's thank Doritt again for hosting here at the Arts Club. This is a terrific spot, historic spot, and a very friendly spot for poets as well as, of course, visual artists. We really appreciate it, Doritt. And to Marty for stepping in literally at the last minute and hosting. Really appreciate that. I'm Hiram Larew. I founded an initiative called Poetry X Hunger, as in Xing out hunger, about 5 or 6 years ago. The subtitle of the initiative is Bringing a World of Poets to the Anti-Hunger Cause. The poem that Henry just read, Fruits of Famine, won the 2021, I believe, World Food Day Prize poem that was co-sponsored by Poetry X Hunger. We worked with the United Nations and a number of other organizations, and as you can see, that was an award-winning poem. So we've brought about 400 or more poets from around the world, and their talents are being used to speak back to hunger, and most importantly, we're using those poems to raise not only political awareness and community awareness, but even financial support for anti-hunger causes. I'm going to be reading a poem from my most recent collection. It was published this year by Cyberwit Press. The title of the book is Patchy Ways, and this poem is all about accepting the notion of getting just a little bit onward in years. It's called Country Stores. It first appeared in a journal called Live Encounters. And let me do a sound check. Can you folks hear me? Is it okay? Okay. Country Stores. I live in meanwhile, my time frays with its undoing. My breath slantly breeze, and these turn pages just suggest me. I hide in the midst of and peek through jaunts or schemes. My sacks are full of longed for. My train whistles and I travel towards wishing on halfway between. Better said, I love country stores that sell that smell of thin or just so. Thank you. So I responded to a snippet in Tender Buttons, the cloth or a cloth.
A cloth. Enough cloth is plenty and more. More is almost enough for that, and besides, if there is no more spreading, is there plenty of room for it? Any occasion shows the best way.
Thanks. I love this snippet. I'm going to read it one more time, Marty. You read it beautifully. Sure. Enough cloth is plenty and more. More is almost enough for that. And besides, if there is no more spreading, is there plenty of room for it? Any occasion shows the best way. My poem in response is titled Rare on Rares. As rags do for clearing hearts, how float or folds or frayings will this woo but dust as cotton loves. These wifely husband also years spread from where to there with every why and might in knotted pattern overlays, all as if has come. How threaded throughs are woven less, how hardly clings to plenty's fringe of cares, then rare on rares, how wondrous spills, best wife and way. My thought on this, Stein, in reading her, I close my eyes. I just have to close my eyes and imagine her chant-like rhythms, her repetition, her work with the common and the vernacular, and yet elevating all of that into the cloud, if you will, just transports me. And so, and I often end reading Stein with more questions than any kind of answers, and certainly more questions than when I started reading her, and I think that was her intent. And so, as I sat down to write, I closed my eyes and tried to revisit the notion of cloth and how the interwovenness of it is somewhat like our lives, and went from there. And really enjoyed the process. And thanks, Karen, if you're seeing this in hindsight, thanks to Karen for giving us the opportunity to do that. Thank you, Marty. Here's our next poet, Don Illich.
Okay, this is my signature poem. It's called The Ad. Single-celled organism seeks same. Must have thin permeable membrane. No fatties. Enjoys proteins, nucleic acids, basic elements, and minerals. Kinky, like splitting apart into separate beings. Interested in long-term relationship leading to evolutionary development. Gills, legs, scales, fur, skin. Brain that thinks, feels, suffers greatly, loves badly, hates well. Find me in hot pea soup of life. I'll be wearing a bow tie, pseudopods raised to the sky. So I'm Don Illich. I've published poems in a variety of places, probably some of the more prominent ones. The Iowa Review, Rattle, Lit, Passages North, Nimrod, 14 Hills. I just recently got into the Southern Review, which has been taking a long time for that. I'm the author of a book of poems from the WordWorks called Chance Bodies. And I think we now have to read, right? It's up top.
It's a very short passage.
Right.
A cool red rose and pink cut pink. A collapse and a sold whole. A little less hot.
Okay, thank you, Marty. Rose recipe. Melody rose, contradiction, cut pink. Nobody's rose, collapse played, seas go dry. Sick rose, crimson joy, no one's sleep. Easy rose, desire to die, so many lids. Warm rose, dark secret love, found out your bed. Sold rose, ceases to bloom, only a bee will miss it. White rose, beyond the sun, violets are done. So I really liked the little bit of text that I got because I was able to think about other authors. Like I used scraps from Rilke and Emily Dickinson and Blake, and I sort of put them into kind of like a recipe of different materials, including the rose stuff from the phrase from Stein. And to me, that was kind of a collage, and it has sort of a three-dimensional quality, the language, I think, because you look and you recognize a phrase from a poet, and then you recognize something from Stein, and then you recognize something that I just put in there, and it has this kind of, at least for me, maybe not for anybody else, has kind of a collage three-dimensional effect. And I also sort of tried to divide it like Stein did her work into like different sections. So you have a melody rose and a nobody's rose and a sick rose. So, I thought that, since Stein was categorized, her different sections, that, I should probably maybe do something similar. But it was a lot of fun writing, and, I, love to do something like this again. Thanks.
I'm Marty Sanchez-Lowery, and my poetry has appeared in Gargoyle, Hispanic Culture Review, and the anthologies Written in Arlington and Knocking at the Door of the White House. I helped to produce the Poetry Alive at IOTA 10th and 20th anniversary CDs, which was one of the most wonderful experiences of my life. And my signature poem is about how I used to cut school in high school and go, I went to Washington Lee High School, and I would go walk across from Arlington to Georgetown University Library. And then I would be daydreaming. And it's called Marking the River. School is a river, daydreaming out of the tall windows, a cross-eyed watch of the silver flowing still. Your mother thought you a little slow, but learning was a wild place on the river's edge where you set feasts of honeysuckle on broad green leaves till they called you late from recess back to the map-making, charting, and intoning of river thought. Then the run home in the river-making rain, hail and thunder defiant, watching the river-making that ran between the cobblestones. Late and much later, there is spring snow, petal pink, drifting on the road, borders of shameless color, sloping away from the embankments. And the river is now marked by wires and silver flags, marked for a river race. And it is a known place that you could mark yourself in that same way, single skull cutting the water, so close to the mark and going forward faster than the river itself. And my poem was a response to a short poem called A Feather. A feather is trimmed. It is trimmed by the light and the bug and the post. It is trimmed by a little leaning and all sorts of mounted reserves and loud volumes. It is surely cohesive. And here's my response. The feathered girl. She alights one estival day like a butterfly kiss, with soft western winds hewing her sail windward. She soared here with a rush of soundlessness and salty light, her plume journey and its story of sheltering and defense intact. And my process, it's, you know, it's a dialogue with Gertrude Stein, and it was like, how do I find an in? And my in was the word trimmed. Trim as in a sailboat, and it brought to me how much I love the Philadelphia story, where Catherine and, says to Carrie about their sailboat, she was yar, wasn't she yar, and they love this boat, So I kept thinking about that, and I gave the feather a female persona, and I made her sail like a sail to a mast. And I thought about her encounters with the wind and how she lent into the light. And I said it in summer because the words the word light and bug are summer. So, I also use the word estival, and so it was a way for me to use the word estival because I love that word. And the bug was the butterfly kiss that can change the world. And what does a feather do in the wind? It encounters everything, and then it's still a feather. It's still intact. And it travels without sound in a world of sound. So that was sort of my thought process. And with that, we are done with our first piece of our presentation. So we're opening up for questions from the audience to any of us. Does anyone have some questions?
Okay. I just wondered, in terms of approaching writing, does this somehow just come to you as an artist, a poet? Do you say, well, I'm only, sometimes people with musical instruments, they'll say, I'm only going to practice 2 hours today, or every day or whatever. Is there anything, is it morning better than evening, or does it just suddenly occur to you, something you've seen in the street or wherever, and then you work on it, or how does that go?
I'll go first, and then I'll hand it over to my gentleman friends here. To me, the best assignment is one where you're like a school, you have to do the assignment. So, you can't procrastinate. And so that was a beautiful thing about this invitation to respond. And there's frastic poetry where people respond to paintings, So respond to the world, and to me, I'm not a habitual writer. I don't sit down and it's just as things come to me, as I'm thinking things through, and then I find a phrase, and then that's my entry.
Right. For me, it's I don't know. I'm one of those people. The hardest part of poetry is to wait. It's a waiting process, and I'm always waiting for them to come. And sometimes they're there, and most times they're not. For me, it is a waiting game. And when they come, I have to honor that. And I have to write every one of them, even the bad ones. I'll write the bad ones right to the end and put them away. They live in my little computer somewhere. And but to me, it is that I am in tune with my inner life and all the little, as we go about our day, we're, say by the week or by the month, we're thinking about this thing or that thing. We are living sort of philosophically. And it's there, and that life is just waiting. It's just waiting for that crack, that bone to come in. And when it's there, it's gels.
So do any of those bad ones ever resurrect and you improve?
I don't go back to the graveyard. The dead stay dead in my world. God, how about you?
Well, I write every day, and I usually write in the mornings, although sometimes in the evening. To me, it's kind of like something from Jack Spicer, where I wait for the alien signals to enter my brain, and then it comes out in, interesting language, hopefully. Sort of, I also do a lot of stream of conscious stuff where I just write, and, mine some of it, or maybe some of it's good enough to stand on its own. Yeah, I have bad ones. I have a lot of bad poems, and sometimes I do try to resurrect them, and that's probably not a good idea. It's probably like Pet Cemetery or something, Poet Cemetery. So I'm probably best leaving them dead. Okay.
I think it's probably safe to say that every poet, probably every artist of any kind, has a different process, and even within a single individual, I don't imagine it's always a constant pattern. I sometimes write regularly, a lot of times write irregularly. I go for long periods where I don't write, and that doesn't bother me because I know I'll come back to it. But everyone who I've ever heard describe their process is very different, which is to be expected, and it's kind of wonderful. I'm also really interested in the whole notion of older poets or poems in the cemetery. I just spent 2 wonderful weeks, really magical weeks, at a conclave up in upstate New York, where I spent the whole time revising some recent poems, but a lot of older poems. And the way I describe it is, some of them required just a haircut trim. Some of them required open heart surgery, completely redoing and bringing back to life. But I enjoyed it thoroughly because it was a chance for me to go back to the younger poet that I was and see kind of what I was doing then and asking questions of myself and revisiting and then in some cases updating. So that's a long answer to your question, but yeah, a little bit of an insight.
How about anybody else?
I guess my question is, as a reader, how would you find, by way of her original work or by way of a critical introduction, where would you find a point of entry into Stein? I've never quite warmed up to Stein, but I suspect that's a flaw in my reading or sensibility, and I suspect I'm in a place to get a good answer.
I have an answer. You do? Let's hear it.
Just go out with Karen. She'll tell you how to do it.
It's true. Karen will introduce you to Stein. I am like you, JD. I was like, this, I don't understand it. I had read Autobiography of L.S.B. Toklas years ago and loved it. But the poetry, and for some reason, it's just the reputation was like, I don't want to go there. It's too much work. But since doing this project, I see what she has done to me is going to open your mind. It's like I said, cracking a nut, because her prompts and her dialogues, I think a lot, Hiram's poetry, if I can, has some of that great things that don't make sense together, but somehow he manages to make sense of them. And his poetry is so beautiful for that reason. And it seems Stein is similar. That there's so much musicality there. so reading The Tender Buttons, which was a love poem, a full love poem to Alice, and according to Karen, it was a love contract. And the critical studies talk about how much sexual inferences there are, and particularly even with the title, The Tender Buttons, the tender nipples, and a tender, what is a tender person, what is tender, and then the secondary meaning of it is, I'm offering you this, I'm offering you this. So what you find in her is that every word has meaning that she has constructed. And it's really amazing.
Okay, yeah. I think the thing with Stein is that it's not necessary to think about sense. What does this mean? It's the appropriate thing to do is just to listen to it, and the sound and the repetitions and that. I think so. In a sense, it's kind of like a forerunner of language poetry, and I think also, I think she's trying to create kind of a three-dimensionality. Like in her short novel, Malenta, I think that's how it's pronounced, but it's the way she writes, and she kind of goes back and forth with things in her language, and it creates the feeling of the story being three-dimensional. So, and I actually wrote a poem outside of this that was kind of influenced by Stein called Gertrude's Cow, which used a lot of, I probably should have found it and read that instead of what I read, but anyway, a professor told me that cow, for Gertrude Stein and Alice Vitopoulos, meant orgasm. So it was basically, the poem I was writing was Gertrude's orgasm, and nothing sexual went on in the poem, but I just like having it, be called that. So, go ahead.
Well, my approach to Stein is, she was really very influenced by the painters and the visual artists of the early 20th century. And so I approach her work the way I approach, what those people did, those early artists, they really liberated us from the idea that I'm telling a story and this is what it is, now you've got to understand it. They liberated us and they said, okay, we're going to have an equal relationship. Here are my visuals. You come to that painting, you come to that abstract work, we can see some here in this room, and you interact with it. And I think that's what I get out of her work. I just come to the language, I don't need to ask a lot of questions. Come to the language and see what happens. One of the most interesting things that I was a tech worker before I retired, and so I wrote a computer program where I took her text from Tender Buttons and wrote 50 sonnets, and I just had it random, just out of random, and it was just fun to play in the playpen that she gives you, and ask no more.
Yeah, and that's what she says. Karen says the invitation to this, to being part of this project was an invitation to play.
No, I don't really have too much more to add. I think Henry put his finger on it. She was playful, almost giddy with words, and as a result opened up a whole new understanding of how words can be assembled and put together and put to work to open eyes and ears and hearts and minds in ways that just simply hadn't been done before. Kind of like the Cubists did with the visual art. So I stand back in kind of awe of what she did. Understanding that part of it is not understanding it. And, but letting it, as Marty was saying, kind of wash over. So yeah, we probably also ought to just take a slight time out to promote the book and the fact that we're just a few of the poets represented in it. I don't remember exactly how many. I think there are like close to
31.
31. So there are 31 poets from near and far who have contributed their take on Gertrude Stein's work. And as you can imagine, there are 35 different takes. Those 31 poets have 35 different takes on her work. So you may want to pick up a copy and enjoy what others have done with her work.
And Karen's intention was as well to make this a text for study, you know. So the whole series will be a way for students to get into this. So I think she's doing the world a favor. Anyone else? Do we have any other questions? No?
Well, I'll ask a question. Okay. I was kind of wondering, you all seem joyful to me. And I was wondering, does the joy come from the writing or from the sharing or the connection that maybe you hope to achieve?
Good question.
Oh, that's a hard one. Yes, I think for me personally, it is the connection. You know, you as a writer, you're a solitary person, and you're speaking to the world. And then when you get together with your other fellow people, it's like community. It is a community, and you know, it's old friends week sometimes, and new friends, and I think it's very beautiful for that reason.
Particularly since post-COVID,
Yeah.
able to get back to it.
Okay.
Yeah, connection's really important. I know that with my poetry, I try to entertain. That's probably my biggest thing that I have, is trying to, you know, bring some humor to it, or bring it, you know, something really interesting, you know, dark and funny or whatever. And that's what I try to do, and that's how I get communion with the audience, and that's how it succeeds. So, for me, so, and I think everybody here wants, you know, to have like a communication with the audience and back and forth.
Okay, well, I'll be a little selfish then. To me, it's like a twofold process. In the first part, the first joyful, there is, if you don't know what I'm about to say, I don't know, but if you've ever written and seen something on a page teach you a lesson, where it comes from, who knows where? And all of a sudden you're writing, and all of a sudden I say, wait, my heart just got opened. I now I see an emotion from an angle I had never seen it before. Knowledge has come to me out of no experience, but just that interaction with those words, with that language. That is one hell of a thing, I'm telling you. If you know what that I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. And then there's the fun, the absolute enjoyment of what Dawn was just saying, the entertaining part. To get up and perform that and connect that and say, you know, I have a bigger heart now. Let me share that bigness with you. So it's a twofold thing.
I would answer yes to the question. I write, and I don't mean to sound corny, but I write out of a deep sense of gratitude and really wonder, understanding that I am pretty privileged, and while I certainly read headlines and am affected by them, I find quite a bit of balm, solace, and joy in poetry and in the writing of it. And then, as all of my colleagues have said, being able to come together and listen to others' work, share your own. I have very big ears, and I think the reason that's because I love to listen to poetry. And so the communal aspect of poetry, be it on Zoom, or as I say, now in post-COVID, we're able to actually get together again, has been a real treat as well.
Anyone else? No? Well, thank you so much all for coming. We have books for sale, so again, we encourage you to hopefully purchase one if you haven't gotten one. And we want to thank the Arts Club of Washington for hosting us. It's absolutely a privilege. Thank you, Doritt.
And join us for a reception.
And there will be a reception afterwards, so.
Thanks, Karen.
Thank you, Karen.